People who were missing as a child. What happened? I went missing when I was 9 years old and stayed gone for 8 years. But here's the thing nobody talks about in those documentaries. I wasn't kidnapped by some creepy stranger in a van. I was taken by this lady named Ruth who thought I was her dead daughter. My name used to be Clara Feldman. I lived in this tiny town in Pennsylvania with my grandma because my parents worked overseas. One afternoon in 1998, I asked Grandma for $2 to get ice cream from the corner store. She gave me the money and told me to be back before dinner. I walked out that door and didn't come home for 8 years. I made it to the ice cream shop just fine, got my usual strawberry cone, and was walking back when this old woman approached me. She had wild gray hair and these really intense blue eyes. She looked at me like she'd seen a ghost and started crying. She kept saying, "Emma, my Emma, you came back to me." I told her my name was Clara, but she wouldn't listen. She grabbed my arm and said my real parents had died in a car accident and that she was my Aunt Ruth who was supposed to take care of me now. I was 9. I was scared. And when some official-looking guy in a suit showed up and confirmed her story, I believed them. Ruth drove me to this isolated farmhouse about 3 hours away. First few weeks, I kept asking when I could call Grandma to let her know I was okay. Ruth always had excuses. The phone was broken. Grandma was traveling. Eventually, she told me Grandma had also died and that talking about my old life would only make me sad. She changed everything about me, cut my hair short, and dyed it black, made me burn all my old clothes. She homeschooled me using these ancient textbooks and never let me leave the property. When I asked about other kids or school, she said, "The world outside was dangerous and full of bad people who would hurt me." Ruth was completely convinced I was her daughter, Emma, who died of cancer when she was 7. She had all these photos of Emma around the house and would point out how much we looked alike. She'd make me wear Emma's old clothes and sleep in Emma's room. Sometimes she'd slip up and call me Emma instead of Clara. The really messed up part was how she treated me. She wasn't evil or abusive. She genuinely loved who she thought I was. She baked me cookies every Friday, read me bedtime stories, taught me how to garden, and sew. If you didn't know the truth, you'd think she was just a lonely grandmother taking care of her granddaughter. But she also controlled everything. I couldn't watch TV because she said it rotted your brain. Couldn't use the phone because strangers might trick me. Couldn't even go to the mailbox alone. She'd follow me everywhere and get really anxious if I was out of her sight for more than a few minutes. When I turned 14, I started asking more questions about my parents and my life before the accident. Ruth would get this panicked look and change the subject or distract me with some activity. One day, I pushed too hard and she had a complete breakdown, screaming and crying about how she couldn't lose Emma again. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I started paying attention to inconsistencies in her stories. She told me we lived in Ohio before my parents died, but sometimes she'd slip and mention places in Pennsylvania. She said I was allergic to shellfish, but I'd eaten shrimp before without problems. 2 years later, when I was 16, Ruth started getting really sick. She'd forget things and sometimes didn't recognize me at all. During one of her confused episodes, she kept asking where Clara was and when Clara was coming home. I asked her who Clara was, and she said Clara was a little girl who used to visit sometimes, but then stopped coming. That night, I went through her bedroom while she was sleeping. Found this old shoebox hidden under her bed, filled with newspaper clippings all about a missing 9-year-old girl named Clara Feldman from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The photo showed a little girl with light brown hair and green eyes. My hair, my eyes, before Ruth changed everything. I sat on that floor reading article after article about search parties and reward money, and my grandma begging for anyone with information to come forward. There was this one photo of Grandma at a candlelight vigil holding my school picture and crying. I'd been gone for 7 years at that point, and she was still looking. The hardest part was realizing Ruth genuinely believed her own story. She wasn't some evil kidnapper. She was a deeply sick woman who lost her daughter and convinced herself I was Emma reborn. In her mind, she saved me from tragedy and gave me a loving, I went missing when I was 9 years old, and stayed gone for 8 years. But here's the thing nobody talks about in those documentaries. I wasn't kidnapped by some creepy stranger in a van. I was taken by a woman named Ruth, who believed I was her dead daughter. My name used to be Clara Feldman. I lived in a tiny town in Pennsylvania with my grandma because my parents worked overseas. One afternoon in 1998, I asked Grandma for $2 to get ice cream from the corner store. She gave me the money and told me to be back before dinner. I walked out and didn't come home for 8 years. I made it to the ice cream shop perfectly fine. Got my usual strawberry cone and was walking back when this old woman approached me. She had wild gray hair and piercing blue eyes. She looked at me like she'd seen a ghost, tears streaming down her face as she said, "Emma, my Emma, you came back to me." I told her my name was Clara, but she wouldn't listen. She grabbed my arm and insisted my real parents had died in a car accident and that she was my Aunt Ruth, now responsible for me. I was 9 and scared. Then an official-looking man came, confirmed her story, and I believed them. Ruth drove me 3 hours away to an isolated farmhouse. The first few weeks, I kept asking when I could call Grandma. Ruth always had excuses. The phone was broken, Grandma was traveling. Eventually, Ruth said Grandma had died too, and talking about my past would only make me sad. She changed everything. Cut my hair short, dyed it black, destroyed my old clothes. She homeschooled me on old textbooks, never letting me leave the property. If I asked about other kids or school, she'd say the outside world was dangerous, full of bad people who'd hurt me. Ruth was convinced I was her Emma, who died of cancer at age 7. She had photos everywhere showing how alike we looked, made me wear Emma's clothes, sleep in Emma's room, and sometimes called me Emma by mistake. What was strange was how she treated me. Ruth wasn't cruel or abusive. She genuinely loved who she thought I was. She baked cookies, read bedtime stories, taught me gardening and sewing. If you didn't know the truth, you'd think she was a loving grandmother, but she controlled everything. No TV because it rots your brain. No phone because strangers might trick you. I couldn't even go to the mailbox alone. She followed me everywhere and panicked if I was out of sight. At 14, I started asking questions about my parents and life before the accident. Ruth panicked and changed the subject. One day I pushed too hard and she broke down, screaming about not losing Emma again. I started noticing holes in her stories. She claimed we had lived in Ohio before the accident, but often mentioned places in Pennsylvania. She said I was allergic to shellfish when I'd eaten shrimp without issue. When I was 16, Ruth grew really sick. She sometimes forgot things and didn't recognize me. Once, during a confused moment, she asked where Clara was and when Clara would come home. I asked who Clara was. Ruth said Clara was a little girl who used to visit but stopped coming. That night, I searched her bedroom and found a shoebox under the bed, filled with news clippings about a missing girl named Clara Feldman from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Photos of a girl with light brown hair and green eyes. My hair and eyes, before Ruth changed everything. I sat there reading article after article about search parties, reward money, and my grandma begging for information. One photo showed my grandma at a candlelight vigil holding my school picture, tears streaming down her face. 7 years had passed since I disappeared, yet she still hoped. The hardest part was realizing Ruth truly believed her story. She wasn't an evil kidnapper. She was a deeply sick woman who lost her daughter and convinced herself I was Emma reborn. In her mind, she had saved me from tragedy and given me love. Story. At my 5-year wedding anniversary dinner, my wife raised her glass and made a toast to being free, single, and searching. While I was still processing it all, my wife handed me a branded t-shirt with years of disappointment written on it. Her mom raised her glass and her dad smiled, so I stood up and made an announcement that left everyone speechless. Chapter 1: The Toast. The restaurant lights shimmered over polished glasses and white tablecloths. It was supposed to be our night. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of struggles, laughter, and hard work. I had even booked a private room, thinking tonight might heal some of the cracks I'd been feeling in our relationship. We stood, glasses raised. I expected words of gratitude, of love, of partnership. Instead, my wife clink-ticked her glass and smiled wide. Here's to being free, single, and searching. The room erupted in awkward laughter. Her friends chuckled. Her mom raised her glass proudly, and her father gave a nod of approval. I sat frozen, the words slamming into me like a fist. Before I could process, she handed me a small gift bag with a smirk. Inside was a t-shirt neatly folded with the words printed in bold letters. Years of disappointment. Her friends laughed harder. Her mom gave her a playful nudge, whispering, "Good one." But I wasn't laughing. I looked around the table, the smug smiles, the mocking eyes. My chest tightened, but not with shame, with clarity. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and raised my glass. Actually, I'd like to make an announcement of my own. The room went silent. They had no idea what was coming. Chapter 2: The Announcement. All eyes turned toward me. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier faded into silence like someone had pulled the plug on their smug celebration. I held my glass steady, my voice calm, each word deliberate. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of support, loyalty, and sacrifice. And tonight I'm given a toast to being free, single, and searching along with a t-shirt that says years of disappointment. I paused, looking at the shirt in my hand. Slowly, I folded it, placed it back in the bag, and set it on the table. My wife's smirk twitched just slightly. Her mother's raised glass lowered an inch. Her father's smile stiffened. I took a deep breath, scanning each face. Well, I suppose this is the perfect time to share my own news. Tonight marks the last anniversary I'll ever spend as this woman's husband. As of tomorrow morning, my lawyer will be filing for divorce. Gasps shot across the table, her fork clattered against the plate. And before anyone asks, no, this isn't sudden. I've known about her affair for months. The only reason I came tonight was to give her the chance to show me an ounce of respect. Clearly, she couldn't manage even that. The silence was suffocating. Only the clinking of glasses from the next room carried faintly through the air. Her mother's eyes widened and her father's face turned stone white. My wife? She sat frozen. The smirk wiped completely from her face, her glass trembling in her hand. So here's to freedom, I said, raising my glass one last time. Not hers, mine. And with that, I downed the wine in one smooth motion and set the glass on the table. The room was stunned, and this was only the beginning of their nightmare. Chapter 3. The Fallout at the Table. The silence that followed my announcement wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The kind of silence where every breath feels too loud and every heartbeat echoes like thunder. Her mother was the first to break, slamming her glass down so hard that wine spilled onto the tablecloth. You can't be serious. Divorce over a joke. I looked her dead in the eye. A joke doesn't last months. Affairs aren't punchlines. Her father's face, once smug with approval, turned crimson. His hand tightened around his glass until I thought it might shatter. He opened his mouth, but no defense came out because deep down he knew the truth was bigger than the spectacle they had orchestrated tonight. My wife's bravado collapsed in seconds. She set the glass down, her voice trembling. Well, you knew about that? I let the silence answer. Her face palled as she realized what I'd just done. Not only exposed her in front of her parents, but announced to them, to her friends, to the world that her little power play tonight had backfired spectacularly. The shirt she'd mocked me with sat on the table like evidence of her arrogance. Around us, other diners were stealing glances, whispering, pointing, the kind of public humiliation you can never scrub away. What she thought would be my moment of shame had turned into hers. Every eye in the room watched as the confident wife with her cruel toast crumbled into a shell of herself. I had walked into that dinner expecting to be humiliated. Instead, I turned their game on its head with one calm announcement. But this was just the tableside fallout. The real consequences were waiting for her outside those doors. Chapter 4. The Immediate Consequences. The tension at the table cracked wide open as the reality of my words sank in. Her father leaned forward, his voice low but trembling with anger. Do you realize what you're doing to our family's reputation? I met his glare without flinching. Your daughter ruined her own reputation the moment she toasted her marriage as if it were a joke. Tonight I simply told the truth. Her mother looked around nervously at the waitstaff staring at the diner, whispering. The shame of being publicly exposed was already sinking its claws into her. My wife reached out for my arm, her voice cracking. Wait. Please, we can talk about this. You don't need to do this here. But I shook my head slowly. No, you chose here. You wanted an audience. Now you have one. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but I saw the panic. Not love, not regret, just fear. Fear of losing the comfort, the image, the safety net she thought she controlled. The whispers around us grew louder. A couple at the next table stared openly, while a man 2 tables down muttered, "Good for him." The humiliation she had planned for me was now hers. In public, irreversible, immortalized in the memories of every witness in that restaurant. I hadn't just walked away from her toast and her cruel gift. I had turned it into the moment that shattered her mask. And as I left that table, I knew the fallout wouldn't stop at whispers. Tomorrow, her entire world, financial, social, and personal, would start to collapse. Chapter 5. The Collapse Begins. The next morning, the echo of shattered pride hadn't even faded when the real consequences started to hit. By sunrise, whispers from the restaurant had already spread. Photos of me standing with my glass raised, my wife's stunned face, and the branded t-shirt on the table were floating across social media. Her friends, the same ones who laughed at the toast, quickly distanced themselves. Some deleted posts of the dinner, others sent her pitying messages. The label she'd tried to stick on me, years of disappointment, had boomeranged back. Now she was the one being ridiculed. Her father called me early that morning, his voice tight with shame. "You could have handled this privately." I didn't raise my voice. She chose public humiliation. I chose public truth. If you can't live with that, it's your problem. For a man obsessed with reputation, the exposure was devastating. It wasn't just her who carried the stain. It was the family name. And that was something they couldn't hide. What she hadn't counted on was the legal prep I'd done weeks before. My lawyer had already drafted divorce papers, ready to file the moment she pushed me too far. Alongside them were financial audits showing she had siphoned money into private accounts to fund her new single life. When she received the papers later that week, her hands shook. The house, the savings, the assets, all legally tied to me. The freedom she toasted was about to leave her with nothing but debts and humiliation. Her cruel toast was supposed to mark my downfall. Instead, it was the first domino in her collapse socially, financially, and within her own family, and I was just getting started. Chapter 6, The Final Lesson and Aftermath. The weeks that followed turned my wife's anniversary toast into the curse that defined her life. What had begun as a dinner prank turned into a scandal she couldn't escape. Friends vanished. The same women who clinked glasses with her that night quietly unfollowed her on social media, terrified of being dragged into the gossip storm. Workplace whispers. Photos of the branded t-shirt made it into her office group chat. Years of disappointment became her nickname in hushed tones. Family disgrace. Her parents couldn't show their faces at community events without hearing the story retold. Her father stopped defending her entirely. The shame was too heavy. The divorce finalized faster than she imagined. The house awarded to me since it was purchased with my savings before the marriage. The accounts? Her siphoning exposed with repayment ordered. The settlement heavily reduced due to her marital misconduct, including public humiliation and infidelity. The woman who raised her glass to being free, single, and searching was left truly single, but broke, disgraced, and bitter. For me, peace came in quiet waves. I poured energy into my business, which flourished without her draining habits. I rekindled friendships she had once driven away. And most of all, I lived free of the mockery, the games, and the cruelty she passed off as humor. Each morning when I walked through the house she had once called hers, I felt nothing but relief. On our anniversary, she toasted to being free, single, and searching. But in the end, it was me who was free. She was the one searching for money, for respect, for a life that had slipped from her grasp. And the final irony, for the rest of her life, the only toast people remembered was the one that destroyed her. Epilogue. Years later, since you asked me to continue, let's look at what happens beyond the divorce. When time itself sharpens the edge of revenge, the anniversary dinner that was meant to humiliate me became the anchor around her neck for years. Reputation. No matter how often she tried to explain, people remembered her as the woman who mocked her own husband publicly and got exposed for it. At family gatherings, her name carried a quiet shame. Finances. Without my support and with her siphoning exposed in court, she lived paycheck to paycheck. Every shopping spree she once flaunted was replaced with budgeting apps and declined cards. Relationships. Men who once admired her confidence soon heard the story too. Few wanted to be tied to someone who had sabotaged their marriage so publicly. What she thought was her liberation became her cage. For me, life didn't just continue. It flourished. Career instability. Without her draining influence, I expanded my work, doubled my income, and invested smartly. Social renewal. Friends I had lost because of her toxicity came back telling me privately, "We always wondered why you stayed with her." Peace of mind. The house I kept became a sanctuary. No more insults passed off as jokes. No more walking on eggshells. The freedom she toasted was never hers. It was mine all along. Years later, when I crossed paths with her family, even her parents admitted quietly, "We thought you were overreacting that night, but now we see she hasn't changed." The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who laughed and clapped for her toast were now apologizing for siding with her. On our anniversary, she mocked me with a glass raised high. Here's to being free, single, and searching. But time flipped the script. She's still searching. I'm the one who's free. And that was the ultimate revenge. Not rage, not scandal, but peace she'll never have.